research and data lead, I'm responsible for that bit. When I was very, very, very new to my role in November of 2019, I wrote a blog about getting started with the indices of deprivation, and that can be viewed on the DataWise London website. And I collaborate also with colleagues from the HERE Network and Coalition for Efficiency through the DataWise London scheme to deliver a qualitative data essentials series, which some of you I recognise have been along to that before, which is great. But if you haven't been, we have a lot of fun. We do a lot of interesting interactive exercises. I'll definitely recommend turning up. I might be a bit biased, but yeah, I really enjoy it, and we've had really good feedback on that as well. Yeah, and to find out more perhaps about signing up to the next Qualitative Data Essentials or any kind of training through DataWise London, feel free to sign up to the Superhighways or London Plus newsletter and follow us on Eventbrite. So promotional piece done. Alice, you may have to go with a poll in a minute. So very, very quickly then, what does this graph represent? And it's a bit of a trick question, but I'll give you a minute to answer that via the poll.
Hopefully the poll's popped up your... If it's
It
in the
has, yeah, I can see
good.
it. I just didn't want to block out the lovely lava lamps.
Yeah, so just drag it, just minimize it or drag it to the side if it's in the way of you having a look at them. You can pick up the corner and drag it to make it little.
Oh, that's too big. I love how someone said it's too early in the morning. Yes, it is. I know, this is a bit of a mean one. Not sure, but it looks cool. It does. It does indeed.
A couple of people who haven't. Anyone, do you want to, whoever hasn't, it's anonymous, so we've no idea who's doing it. But if anyone, those last two people want to put in a vote.
No?
No?
Okay, so yeah, the majority of you were correct. It's the deprivation score for the IMD. So the score for each borough stratified by political control. And that actually, oops, oh, how do I go to the next slide? Yeah, so this is what it actually looks like as a wave plot. So you can see the average deprivation score for each borough along the bottom, and then the political party control at the local government level for each borough. And the trend here, of course, is that the more deprived the area, the more likely they are to vote for a Labour Party, and then the more affluent the area, with the exception of the City of London, of course. They tend to vote for either Lib Dem or Conservative. And the actual initial code for the graph is from Open Data Manchester, and they do a series of data dives called the Pick and Mix, which are really, really great. If you're into programming, I would definitely recommend signing up because you get to generate some really cool stuff. So very quickly then, an introduction to the IOD, so the who, where, what, why and how. I know it's a little bit childish, but for me it was the easiest way to break it down. So yeah, sorry if it feels a bit like primary school, but hopefully it's useful. Okay, so who? So the government started publishing the indices of deprivation in the year 2000. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government are currently responsible for publishing the IOD. It's published periodically, so that means it's published from time to time. So there's not a particular frequency or interval in which it's published. So you'll see that the range kind of changes from every kind of like 3 to 5 years. So yeah, these are all the existing sets. So you've got 2000, 2004, 2007, 2010, 2015, and then the latest publication, which is 2019. And it's quite a nice data set actually, because if you think about the change, even within the UK and our political landscape from the early 2000s to the late 2010s, there's a lot of change there. So the data set is quite a useful example of a longitudinal study that you can look at. So where, and this is the one that almost caught me out. I won't go into details as to why, but the indices of deprivation are officially named the English indices of deprivation. The reason for that is because the data set accounts for England only. So some ONS data sets account for England and Wales, don't be fooled. This data set only accounts for England. So Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland aren't covered, and that's mainly due to the political jurisdiction over intelligence. So if you were interested in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland indices of deprivation data, they've all got their own. And yeah, you can't directly compare, this is just an important methodological note, you can't directly compare the English indices of deprivation to, say, the Scottish indices of deprivation, and that's because each data set is a case within its own right. So essentially the statisticians behind the set have their own practices and methods. So a direct comparison, say you wanted to say there'd been a percentage increase between England and Scotland, you couldn't do that because they're two separate cases. So the IOD are gathered and analysed on a geographical basis. It's otherwise known as statistical geographies. And that means each piece of data in the indices of deprivation is specific to the area it was measured from. The indices of deprivation uses a particular type of base map at a small local area level, and these are known as the lower layer super output areas. And they contain around 1,000 to 3,000 people, or 400 to 1,200 households. And then you can see the largest to smallest. So OCSI actually have a really great free resource, the links in the presentation, but you can see the largest level that you would look at in this kind of map is the local authority, down to the middle layer super output area. Then you've got the lower layer super output areas and output areas, which are the smallest. Yeah, so like an onion, statistical geographies have many layers. So this was actually produced by Kate at Superhighways. So you can see the smallest part of this geography is a point, then a postcode, then an output area, lower super output area, middle layer super output area, then you've got the ward, borough, county and region. So Kate actually ran through the stats on London. So an output area in London accounts for roughly 300 people. Lower layer super output area, 1,700 people. Middle layer super output area, 7,200 people, and a ward has approximately 13,000 people. And yeah, if you, when in doubt, think of Shrek. So these maps are like ogres. Ogres have got layers, onions have got layers, and so have these statistical geographies. So if you're still confused, don't worry, we've got you covered. So these are a few free resources. So Map It UK, you can look up your postcode and find an array of information about the statistical geography associated with that postcode. You've also got a local authority lookup dashboard, which is really useful. Local authority on Map Drive, where you can actually find the local authority map to download, and then the Explorer tool and GLA resources I'm going to come back to. But I'm just going to very, very, very quickly demo these for you. So in Map It, for example, I'm based in Ingatestone, so I'm going to put my postcode in. And then I've got information about Ingatestone. So I'm interested in the lower layer super output area. So now I'm Brentwood 002B. So then I can use the lookup dashboard by, I think it's the government on Power BI, which is really cool. So I can type in here Brentwood. Ooh, not in caps. Sometimes it likes to work. There you go. Right, Brentwood. Yay. Okay. And then I can look here and I can see that, you know, in my postcode 002B, we're ranking 29,814th and we're in the 10th decile, which doesn't surprise me because we have a lot of mansions a couple of miles away from my house. So Ingatestone seems to be performing pretty well. And then if I go to the map drive, which is very, very useful, don't be intimidated by it. It's really great. I type in Ingatestone by pressing Control F. Oh, if it won't let me do that, okay. Or I try Brentwood. Oh yeah, because it's local authority. I can find the Brentwood map and I can download this, and it will tell me about areas of deprivation in Brentwood. So you can see there are a couple of kind of dark blue spots there, but you can also see they're very, very kind of affluent areas, which probably explains why we're one of the safest Tory seats in the UK anyway. So what? The lower super output area is scored and ranked based on its performance across the 7 domains of deprivation. So here they are. And each domain of deprivation measures the variables pictured to the right. So you've got income, employment, crime, health, barriers to housing, living environment. And though basically all of these are measured depending on various rates that are recorded per area, and then they're weighted and combined to provide an overall deprivation score for that area. The reason why these have been selected is pretty ambiguous, to be honest, from the IOD website, but there is a reference, obviously, to the academic literature surrounding these things. So, you know, a lot of academics have decided that these are the best ways to kind of measure deprivation in an area, and so the statisticians in the government use these measures, and they weight them in a particular way as well, obviously, so that one, say, doesn't have you know, one that's considered to have less of an impact on deprivation isn't weighted so heavily, and then something, you know, like income, for example, which would have quite a big impact on deprivation, is weighted more heavily. But yeah, the main takeaway point from this really is that deprivation, like the quality of life or happiness, is a difficult thing to measure, and so requires kind of a more of a kind of multivariate approach. And once the score is generated, each lower level super output area across England is ranked to create a scale. So from most deprived to least deprived, and that scale is what is known as the index of multiple deprivation. So just to note, although a lot of you know, data scientists and people in the sector might refer to it as the IMD, I know I've been guilty of that crime. It is actually the IOD. The IMD is an index within the indices of deprivation. So they're not technically the same thing, but I don't think anyone's going to arrest you for getting them confused. At least I hope not. Anyway, yeah. So just to demonstrate how it works. These variables go in, some statisticians do some very, very complicated maths, and a deprivation score comes out, and then obviously you have your index. So that then basically ranks these scores against one another across England. So, you know, basically it goes from 1, which is the most deprived area, to 32,844 is the least deprived area. So all that you need to take home from that really is the closer to 1, the worse the ranking. It goes the same thing for the domains. So the higher the score for the domains, the worse the area is performed. But in terms of the rank, the closer to 1 it is, the worse the ranking. So it can be a little bit confusing, but don't worry, I'll demonstrate how that works. Yeah, and then you can see that basically, you know, you've got 1 to 32,844, and then that index is plotted comparatively towards other different deprivation scores, and they're on that scale. So why and who? So very quickly, it enables individuals from different sectors and occupations to better understand the social challenges facing an area of interest. So that could be, you know, postcode, town, city, ward, borough, region. It's commonly described as the £1 billion data set, and that's because it's used to inform decision making on a national, regional, pan, city / town and local authority basis. But I know that you probably all know that anyway as professionals from the sector. The main users of the IOD are therefore intelligent generalists. So there's no specific domain of expertise per se, but they'll have a hunch or interest that they want to follow up on. So yeah, I tend to think of it of a bit like Guess Who. So got a range of people from policymakers to charities and think tanks to infrastructure organisations. A few of you here are from CVSs, which is great. Data scientists, activist groups, politicians, journalists, teachers, individuals, local councillors, a whole range of people. And a lot of work has been done actually to encourage citizen science around these data sets. So the department behind the set have been really putting a lot of money into creating accessible tools to engage a wider audience of users. The idea is that even Joe Bloggs on the street could access the IOD if he so wished. So examples of it in practice, you've got journalistic applications. I think this was from The Sun. GLA use it, for example, for heat mapping across London. I actually did a data dive back in August, and we used the IOD to look at the correlation between deprivation and crime. And also there's more of these kind of community facing data dives. So Open Data Manchester, for example, did a community data dive with members of the council and various organisations, and they actually looked at the IOD in the area. And I know very recently there's also been a citizens advice, Lewisham and Sobus have also done kind of a community facing data dive as well with DataKind UK, and there'll be more on that forthcoming, but it does have a lot of applications. So the how, so it's not wild data, so it's been heavily processed is the biggest takeaway point from this, really, by the statisticians that work on the data set. So do not be surprised if you may have your own internal data at your organisation, or you might be aware of data that exists at kind of a local level and it doesn't seem to match up with the IMD. That's totally normal. It's because the IOD/IMD is a very, very processed thing. So think of it a bit like a bear. What you have is, or what you might have is wild and free and roaming around, and the the IOD is a bit like a Build-A-Bear. And I don't know if you've ever been to one of these places, but there's a lot of process involved in kind of like selecting a teddy bear and then stuffing it and then putting outfits on it and stuff like that. I find it quite a good analogy for the kind of amount of process that is going into the IOD to generate those outputs that you see. So don't worry too much if things don't match up. Also, when you, again, following on from that point, if you're looking at a particular domain of deprivation, be attentive to the fact that the overall deprivation score for your area would have been weighted accordingly. So as I said earlier, it's not a 1/7 split. Some things are weighted more than others, and there's also a population weighting, which we'll cover in a second. And yeah, another thing, so deprivation scores are very different from index ranks. So if you see anything with the word rank in it in the IMD, it's a comparative measure. So it's in comparison to the other pieces of data that exist for other areas. So that score in itself cannot be analysed in isolation. It has to be taken as part of a scale. And there's also an important point that like all data, really, the IOD is at best a representation of something that's happening within the social world. So this might resemble a bear in a way, but you can see it's a very, very different thing, right? So any kind of data that you have, there's always going to be some kind of process behind it. It's not a naturally occurring social phenomena. So yeah, point to take away there is that there's a lot of process. Don't be afraid if things don't match up with what you might know about the full picture. So deadly sins for the IOD, do not be tempted to add it all up. Quite a simple one, really, because there's so much process behind the set. Don't try and make it even more complicated by doing maths, because the outputs won't be correct. And despite the statisticians actually creating a 2015-2019 mapping tool, which we'll cover a little bit later, you can't measure absolute change over time between the sets. You can't say something like there's been a percentage increase of X from 2015 to 2019. Because again, just like the Welsh and Irish and Scottish data sets, each set is a different case over time. So for example, when we did our data dive, we looked at the crime rate and we found that, it was just not comparable over time anyway, because the political targets around measuring crime had changed during that period. So each IMD or IOD is a case in itself. So if in doubt, find a route out. FAQ document is really, really useful. If you've fallen down a bit of a rabbit hole and you want to check that your maths is right, DataWise London, we're always available. Contact us with your query and we'll try and help you the best we can. And also the classic one, Google it. If in doubt, just type in, can I do this? You'll find lots of threads on Stack Overflow, which is like a programming website, but a lot of people are talking about data on there, and you'll be able to find an answer to your question on there. Yeah, and finally, do watch out for rabbit holes, a bit like Mario here. Try and get a trampoline and try and get out of there as soon as possible, because it's such a broad and deep data set that it's very, very easy to get lost in the details. So getting started, this might seem a bit obvious, but I'm going to go through it anyway. So here's the location, and there's a couple of things to note about this. So there are a lot of files available, so downloading the right data set for your type of query is key to getting the most appropriate answers. The web page is also rich with resources and interactive tools to help everyone participate in citizen science. They're also quite well hidden. I don't know whether they were kind of going for an Easter egg hunt vibe there, I don't know, but yeah, make sure that you're not missing out on those. And here's a few of my favorite freebies. Mapping resources, the statistical release is another really good one. The infographic is great, and frequently asked questions, literally just Control F and type in your question. So I don't know, something like you're looking for average score, and it will highlight the word in the text and you'll be able to find your answer, and the technical reports. I'm just going to very, very quickly show you what. So this is the statistical report. It's very, very useful. I mean, there's 31 pages of it. I wouldn't read it all, but it gives you a really nice summary of what's happening at the UK level. And then there's also the infographic, which is very, very useful. So that's a 2-pager, just basically shows you how things are calculated and what the UK looks like at a glance. And then the frequently asked questions. So say I was looking for average score. I've done it again. Yeah, it can be case sensitive, by the way. Sorry, I should have noted that. The example doesn't want to work, but you will be able to actually search through this and find like average score and find the answer to your question. So that can be really useful. There's also the technical report, which is kind of like the hardcore statistician version of that document. I wouldn't really recommend it unless you are a real kind of stickler for statistical details, of which case go for it. But otherwise, yeah, frequently asked questions will basically communicate the answers that you need. So I'm going to do an example. Anyone who's kind of a whiz with Excel, this is just my way of doing it. So you might have particular way of doing analysis, and that's fine, but this is the way I do it. So just very quickly, this is some stuff I made earlier, looking at the different domains of deprivation and then the rank across Newham. So how did I make this? So I downloaded file 10 from the website, and don't worry, the instructions are in the slide. And then I created, say, like a template. And I've got the average score for each. So how do I look that up? Well, I've turned these tabs into tables, which you can do by pressing Control T. So if I'm looking for, say, Newham, type it in, filters it through for me so I don't have to chunk through all of the data. And then I've got the average score there, which is 0.169. Then I would just copy and paste that across. And then I'm going to generate a really, really quick table. So I can see stuff happening in the chat. I hope everything's okay and everyone can see my screen.
So Sarah going, wow.
Wow. Oh, okay. That's great. Thank you.
Nice.
So I'm going to show you how you can do it, right? So I presume everyone knows how to make a table, but I've showed you how you would look it up, for example. And then once you've put this into a table, literally all you do is you highlight both of these columns. Don't highlight the overall score because it will skew your results. So you highlight both of those, you click insert on the insert ribbon, you go to the 2D graph column, and you've got something that looks a bit like this. And then what you would do is you would go in, you would change the title to, I think I had it as NUM, didn't I? NUM IOD 2019. Are these filtered already? Did I filter them? So if you've got them in a table, you can filter from like smallest to, oh no. See, even I'm guilty of this. So I'm just going to remove this from here. Yeah, smallest to largest. So look at that. You can already like filter through each of these. And then you can click on this button basically to change the style. And then to get the call outs, like I added in, if you click, oops, the banners come down. You see, I'm not an expert at this like Alice. So yeah, you'd go to add chart element, add data labels, data call out, and then you might want to like drag and drop that one if it will play ball.
Don't worry if it doesn't. We get the idea.
Yeah, but you get the idea. So you can do this very, very easily. All you need to do is just navigate the data set, create a table, look for the score, and then you can literally just put it in this format, and this will also be available to you after the session as well that you can use, and basically it will generate a nice graph for you and you'll be able to see how it performs. So it's quite interesting. I actually did a little dive into how well Brentwood was performing, and I was quite surprised at the results. So you can see it's actually scoring pretty badly for a lot of things, but we seem to be doing really well for health and crime, employment and income, so it's quite interesting. So back to my slides. Yeah, so the instructions are also on here as well. So average scores.
Lucy,
Yeah.
sorry, quick question. There's a question from Maya in chat.
Saying,
sorry, a silly question. The average score is the data where 0 is the worst and 30,000 is the best.
No, so it's the other way around. So the higher, so the index 1 is the worst. So that's basically, think of it as a ranking. So first is the worst and last is the best. Whereas in terms of the average score, the higher the score, the worse the area is performed for that thing. So the score is different to the index. The index is a comparison. So say you would have Brentwood compared to Newham, for example. Brentwood might be, I don't know, 200th or something, and Newham might be 5th. So you can see that Newham, in comparison to Brentwood, is performing worse. Whereas Brentwood's, if you looked at the overall scores for Brentwood, for example, you'd see that this isn't, the higher it is, the worse it's performing. But this actually answers a question that I was just about to raise. So average scores at a glance, essentially these can be a little bit confusing because they are weighted against the population of an area. So if I'm looking at Brentwood, for example, Brentwood is quite an affluent area, right? So it's quite surprising that Brentwood has performed badly across, you know, the living environment, the barriers to housing and services, education, skills and training, right? You know, it seems a little bit confusing, but that's actually because it's got a population weighting. So essentially the population weighting can affect the output that you get. So it's always really good to actually look at, if you are looking at the average score for an area, to also look actually at the how it's performing on the index as well, because that will give you a good indicator of whether that score is, say, exceptionally good or exceptionally bad for an area. So don't worry, it will become a little bit clearer. So yeah, if the average score data is confusing, compare the figures against the rank of average score for each domain. So this was what I rustled up in Excel. So I had a look at Newham, because obviously, you know, Newham has been reported to be one of the most deprived areas in London. So I had a look, and Newham actually seems to be performing, well, I mean, it performs really badly for barriers to housing and services, right? I mean, that's like almost like a score of 50, and that's very high. And you can see that that's actually reflected in the rank, because, you know, it's ranking number 1, which of course, when we think about our index, you know, number 1 is the worst, right? So it's performing really badly. But then you've also got things like education, skills and training, it seems to perform badly, right? But then actually, you know, it's 186th on the scale for education, skills and training. So arguably not as bad as, you know, 185 other areas, right? But similarly, you know, the crime score there is looking good. The income is looking okay. You know, obviously minus figures are better. It's an indication that, you know, it's doing really, really well. But here, you know, it seems to be doing okay, but actually when we look at the rank, we see, you know, relative to the population and other areas, actually it's performing quite badly in terms of crime, in terms of income. So another poll then, very, very quickly, before we move on to a quick exercise about the exploring deprivation in London across the GLA data set. So Alice, if you wouldn't mind setting up a poll, I've just got a quick question for you about this graph and what it shows us. So what is the City of London showing us here? Why might it be performing so badly?
We do drag it off to the side, guys. You've got just
Yeah,
your view.
sorry.
Couldn't decide when to launch it.
This is interesting. It looks like everyone, with the exception of one person, has voted, so I'm just going to wrap it up. Yeah, so everyone who said the population weighting has affected the result is right. But similarly, if you said it's very wealthy because of the banking industry, you'd probably also be right in a kind of indirect way. Essentially, it's the population weighting. So because it's a very, very wealthy banking kind of commercial area, right, and it's kind of special, it's got its own independent stuff going on. I'm going to presume not a lot of people live there, and that's why basically the City of London seems to be performing so badly. It's because hardly anybody lives there, and so the population result is always going to skew what's there. So if I just come out of this very, very quickly and I
Oh,
show you.
sorry, Lucy. Just before you move on, we've got a question from
Yeah,
Kathy,
sure, yeah.
which is she's saying, is that rank out of 32,844? Sorry, it was for the one before with the rankings.
Yes, it is technically. But when you actually open up the data sets, it's quite confusing because it can sometimes be out of 300 odd. I'm not quite sure about the maths behind that. It was something you have to look up in the frequently answered questions, but there obviously is a reason for that.
Kathy just asked as well, is that maybe it's just London?
Yeah. I mean, it could be. I think it is relative to the area that's being measured. So for this data set that I'm looking at here, this is actually a pre-prepared data set by the GLA. So the intelligence team at the GLA, I downloaded this from the data store, just typed in IMD London boroughs, and I found this, and this has been prepared. So the city intelligence team have filtered through the IMD to create this for London. So I'm not quite sure what their process would be, but in terms of the actual original IOD set, I think it is somewhere from like 1 to 300, and I think there must be some way, they must have some way of kind of like condensing that down, because obviously scrolling through 32,000 entries might be a bit long. I think it may also be to do with something like, for example, if you look at local authority, there's not 32,000 local authorities across the UK, right? There's a smaller amount, probably around 300 or something like that, which is why it's condensed by that field. So it's always important to kind of look at the field. I think the 32,000 measure might actually come from the lower super output area, but I'd have to follow up on that. But I'm just going to show you the wrangling you can do for London as well. So this I downloaded from the data store. I'm not going to show you how to produce these, but it's very, very similar to the one I kind of rustled up earlier with Gordon Ramsay, the Excel for Newham, for example. So this is the average score across London, and then as you can see, to kind of contextualize that, I've compared that against the rank of average score for London. So this gives us kind of a better idea really of what's going on. So this is the overall score for each borough, and then this is the rank. So you can see, you know, you've got Barking, Dagenham, Hackney, Newham, Haringey, Tower Hamlets, Islington, Lewisham, Southwark. You know, these are kind of like the top 5, top 10 most deprived areas, and then, you know, no surprise really that you've got Richmond upon Thames as scoring, you know, very, very low or very, very high in terms of that rank, meaning that obviously they are not as deprived as, say, Barking and Dagenham, that comes in at 21. And I've prepped this set for you already, so you wouldn't need to prep it yourself. But essentially these are the 2 tabs that you need. So you look at the domain summaries, and this will give you the average score and rank for each area. So this is for income, for example, but there's also the 7 other different domains there. You've got the summary measures, which will show you the overall score and then where that ranks on the scale. But there's also a couple of other things. So population is a really interesting one to look at, but this will be obviously on a lower super output area level. But you can see, you know, different population breakdowns. And if you wanted to search for, say, City of London, you could, yeah. So you can see not really a lot of people living there, right? I mean, in comparison to, say, Barking and Dagenham. So that's why City of London is coming up, if we look here, as scoring particularly badly, because the population weighting has affected it. So I'm aware we're kind of running out of time a little bit. So I spoke about the Easter egg hunt earlier. If you go onto the link that's in the slide about accessing the IMD, you'll see that on the main page, next to the statistical release, there's a list of related contents, and this mapping resource is an amazing piece of content. Please use it. I'm just going to show you what it looks like very, very quickly. If it opens, it did crash the other day. That was because my internet is rubbish. But I'm going to show you very, very quickly how you might want to look up somewhere. So I'm going to look up Brentwood, because I'm an Essex girl, and I'm going to see how Brentwood looks. So this is Brentwood, the different kind of lower super output areas and output areas in Brentwood. I'm going to look at Ingatestone actually. I'm going to click on that. So this is where I live. So how has this done over time? Not really much changing there. Still very, very affluent because it's lightly coloured. I might want to look at, say, something like, I don't know, let's have a look at health. So I'm looking at health, and I can see that, you know, we're doing pretty well in terms of our health. There's different kind of variables that you can look at here. So this one looks quite interesting. It looks a bit like crime may have actually changed. Yeah, so in 2015, crime here was possibly worse than it was in 2019. So yeah, this is a great tool. You can look at each of the different domains without having to go into Excel and cook things up with Gordon Ramsay. You can literally just go in, select your area or your postcode, look at how it performs, and it will update that in real time for you. And you can also look at it side by side with 2015, or you could just turn it off and look at it for 2019. So yeah, if you don't fancy Excel, this is quite a good one. If you click on the information button, it will show you about the rank, and it will give you a little summary of how well or how badly your area performed. So ideas for a deep dive. I'm going to hand over to Alice. She's got an example for you from Sutton.
I have, oops, sorry, just in chat. Oh, can you go back one slide? Sorry, Lucy.
Yep.
Oh, hang on.
Oh,
Missing one.
oh, you're missing a slide.
I'm missing a slide.
Oh
no.
no. Okay.
Never mind. Don't worry. Just if
Improvise.
you go down to the one below. Go down to the one below.
This one.
So yeah, thank you. So Lucy and I thought would be good to show kind of a practical application. And since, as you all know, Superhighs, we work with lots of small charities. So we thought we'd use one of our own case studies, basically. So this is a map of Sutton, and it's using the indices of deprivation to show where there's deprivation in the borough. So you can see, as the maps before, where it's darker, it's the more deprived areas, and where it's lighter, it's less deprived. So we were approached by a charity working in Sutton who had a centre in Sutton and were delivering service borough-wide, and they were concerned that they weren't reaching everybody in the areas where they thought help was needed, and they needed to be able to kind of actually evidence that in order to get funding to be able to increase their service delivery. So together we produced this map for them, and then we compared it against their own service delivery. So on the right hand side you can see their service delivery of the charity itself. So no prizes for guessing where their office is based. So the darkest shows the number of clients, the number of service users, and the lighter areas show where they've got less service users. So there's incredibly dense around where they're based in terms of number of service users. And then it kind of extends a bit, doesn't it, around it, probably with maybe that number 18, that's slightly further away, probably there's a good transport link or something in there where their office is. But they're missing, aren't they? You can see there's a couple of areas in the north of the borough, and then one off in the east of the borough, of areas where they're showing much more severe deprivation, and they've got hardly any service users in those areas. So they use this to kind of inform what their service delivery model, and to start reaching out and delivering service in those more deprived areas. So this is incredibly simple to do for your own. It's kind of one of those like nice, quick, easy wins of just kind of being able to have a look at your own service delivery area. The way we've done it, we're missing a slide with a link, but we'll stick it in before we send it to you. Don't worry. We're missing a link, but this is the London Data Store has this Excel template, and basically all you do is you export the data out of your database or your Excel spreadsheet, whatever you're using, and then you use the people's postcodes to map them towards or to lower super the areas, and then you just pop them into this Excel template. There's a blog on the Superhighway site that tells you how to use it. And if you go back to the slide before, Lucy, we'll just have a quick look at one more before, sorry. Yeah, lovely, thanks. So these steps which are in here, and we'll stick in the other side, but these are kind of basic steps that you do with kind of just getting your data out into Excel. If you might not have a ward entered in, you might only have postcodes or something, in which case there are lots of tools that can help you add wards, match wards up with postcodes, and then you can use pivot tables to count sort of how many people you've got in each ward, and then you just pop those high level numbers into this template, and you can change the colors and whatever, but it's relatively straightforward to use. We'll send out the link. If anyone's using it and gets stuck, then obviously give me a shout, and I can totally help you to do that. And I will stick the slide in with the link because that would help. So you can find
it. Sorry
oh, here
about
we go.
that.
You've got a London Data Store slide anyway, so that's fine.
Yeah. So I'm just going to follow on from that. And sorry, Alice, I kind of sabotaged your part of the presentation.
Don't worry.
There were some more slides which demoed how to do that, but I don't know how they got chopped out of the deck. So yeah, really sorry about that. But just in the like final kind of like 7 minutes. So as Alice says, London Data Store is a great resource. You've got bespoke data sets customized to show data about Londoners. So that one that I just showed you, where I looked at the City of London, for example, in comparison to other locations in London, that is a London data store set. You just go on the website, type in IOD, Londoners, and it will come up with that data set. There's also a link to it in the slides as well. It's updated regularly with recent figures, and it's also got archives of previous projects, which is really good if you want to look at stuff over time. It's completely free to use. It's straightforward to access and user friendly. So a lot of the people in the intelligence team are working really hard to update it and to make sure that people are able to access what they need from it. So that's constantly under review. And yeah, use it or lose it. So obviously the GLA capture data on user activity on the London data store, and they're always looking to review that. So if you want kind of like more investment in that as something that is a free resource for everyone to use, then make sure that you really take up the offer of using that data store, because the more people that use it, the more they'll look to improve the data store. And here is a couple of data sets I found on the data store that if you were looking at the indices of deprivation, you might want to consider these in comparison to that. So if you had a particular hunch, you could use these and compare the indices of deprivation against these sets. So yeah, you can literally just click the link and browse by topic, or you can search a key phrase. So I've got personal well-being by borough, really interesting to look at that, especially in terms of deprivation. How is personal well-being, say, across the top 5 most deprived boroughs in London? London Borough Profiles and an atlas. So this is another useful resource, gives you a breakdown of key indicators across the borough. So say you've got something in the IMD like living environment, for example, and you wonder, what does that really mean? The atlas will break down those stats for you, so it will give you details about the environment or housing in that area. Food security, somebody was saying they were looking into food security. This is a good data set. Cultural infrastructure, again, another interesting one. Is there a correlation or association, if you like, between cultural infrastructure, lack of cultural infrastructure and deprivation, or is there an association between personal well-being and lack of cultural infrastructure, for example, in deprived areas? And then the socio-economic impact of COVID-19, which is, there's also a London community survey, which is an ongoing piece of work in this area. But yeah, it really is like a real treasure trove. There's so much on there. I would really recommend taking some time just to have a look through the different topics that are on there if you're doing a piece of research, just because there's so many things that can just come up and can be really, really useful. Another really useful resource is the Co-op Wellbeing Index. You can access it here. It's basically an alternative data set to the indices of deprivation, and it measures the more qualitative and therefore sadly more often overlooked aspects of community well-being. So you can see here it looks at people, so it looks at health, education, learning. These are very, very similar to the IOD, but then it also looks at things like relationship, so relationships and trust, equality, voice and participation, and then it looks at things like place as well, so cultural heritage and leisure resources, housing space and environment, transport, mobility and connectivity. So these kind of what we would call social capital, indicators of social capital are measured here alongside the kind of harder measures of deprivation as well. And there's a link that you can click, and that is a link to the short report, which basically just explains how they came about. So looking at Newham and Brentwood through the lens of the community wellbeing asset, you actually see that there's a really big difference. So actually Newham is actually outperforming Brentwood, right? Even though Newham is branded as one of these very, very deprived places, and Brentwood, because of the Only Way is Essex and Towie fame, is branded as one of these really affluent areas, right? So the main takeaway point here is that deprivation is not always a hallmark of absent community life, and actually contrary to popular opinion, more deprived communities communities tend to be more neighbourly than their wealthy counterparts, and there's been a lot of research into this. And always remember, of course, an ethical point, that there's more to the statistics than meets the eye. So like our teddy bear, right, this is just a depiction of social reality. It's not actually the real thing. So yeah,
Lucy,
you can,
sorry,
yep.
just before we wrap up, one quick question from Sarah about
Mm-hmm.
the co-op ones, about how do they gather their data, do you know?
Yeah, so it would be explained in the short report, but I think they actually do it through like surveys, I believe, and also focus groups as well. But it is interesting, and they also look at mapping the community assets as well. So yeah, take a look at the short document; it will answer all of all of those questions. But I would also say you should also consider using qualitative data. So this lady here is a lady called Lisa Mackenzie. She actually did a brilliant study into life in St Anne's in Nottingham, which is often, identified as one of the most deprived areas in the country. She did ethnographic work and really, showcased that actually there's a lot more to these people who are kind of branded as, deprived and criminal by the government than meets the eye, basically. You've also got your own things, so case studies you might have as an organisation. These are another brilliant source of knowledge that can be used either to complement or to challenge IOD findings. Interviews are useful as well. Focus groups, another thing you might want to look at, or even your own written feedback from surveys and things like that. These can all be resources that you should always think about kind of holistically when you're looking at the indices of deprivation data. I know I'm over a little bit, so I just wanted to wrap up very, very quickly. So the reason why I've got bulldozer here is obviously this £1 billion data set can have bulldozing effects. So for example, if I type into Google poorest areas in the UK map, I can see that the indices of deprivation has been used to feed these, right? So you can clearly see that a journalist has used the indices of deprivation to talk about England's most deprived areas. But actually, there are real world consequences to this. And of course, there's a utility of from a data set that identifies deprivation, because of course we're able to identify where there needs to be more support or more provision. But similarly, actually, this can have really big real world effects for people. So if you're grouping or classifying people and pigeonholing them, in effect, say you brand people as living in a particular community that has got a very high crime rate, one of the things that decision makers may then do is enforce more policing in that area. And then actually the consequence of that is that you get particular groups maybe then subjected to more stop and search. And then you end up with things like perpetuation of systematic biases, and you end up with people's lived experiences being affected, and things like the London riots. So it's always really, really important to keep an open mind, especially with these big statistics that can really kind of bulldoze people and places into a particular label like deprived or criminal. And stuff like that. So final point, knowledge is power, and this is really why the citizen science aspect of this is important. So this is my favourite quote from a guy called Michel Foucault. He said, it's the reappearance of what people notice at a local level of disqualified knowledges that makes critique possible, right? And the point about that, obviously, is that what you know as a small organisation, what individuals know about the communities that they live in is really, really important. And that's why people need to engage more with the indices of deprivation. The data scientists that create these sets with the best will in the world, they don't know about the blind spots that exist. So when they're creating these sets, they're applying labels to particular people, particular groups, particular communities, and then these go on to have consequences, right? So the more that you can engage with the IOD in your own work, the more you can kind of challenge the presumptions of the data set, the more you can really help the people in your community. And that's me done. Thank